How many of you have been here for at least one open classroom class before? Wonderful. So many of you know what this is all about. For those of you who have not been here before, let me review what we've done with the open classroom in the past. The very first semester, which was the spring of 2008, Paul Grogan, the president of the Boston Foundation, and I taught a course called The 21st Century City. We looked at how cities had developed over time through the lens of sociology, economics, political science, and tried to look at some of the challenges that cities face. In the fall of 2008, in the semester in which we were having the presidential election, we turned our attention to the whole question of policy advice to the next president. And I shared this lectern with Michael Dukakis, our colleague in the political science department here at Northeastern University. And for those of you, any of you remember that? We had a wonderful time. They had people from all over the map, including David Gergen, who was with us after the election. And then later on, we did an open classroom devoted to economic growth with social justice. And I was able to teach that class with our friend Kathy Minahan, who at the time had just retired as the president and CEO of the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, a woman who in her day job set interest rates for the entire world. And then we looked at globalization. We looked at international economics, global security, and world culture, looking at everything from the whole question of how the economy had been globalized, to looking at issues of Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, to finally looking at jazz, photographs, photography, music, and art. And then last semester, we had Professor Dukakis back with us to look at the question of policy advice to the governor during a semester in which, of course, our governor was reelected. And now we come to the one that I've been wanting to do from the very beginning. For more than 40 years, I've taught economics at Boston College, UMass Boston, and now at Northeastern. And in all of that time, I've looked at labor markets, I've looked at economic development, I've looked at housing, a whole range of subjects. But increasingly, as I looked at this over the last decade or so, I realized that I'd spent 40 years in the wrong profession. That really what mattered is demography. Changing nature of society as society either becomes younger or older, changes in terms of gender relations, changes in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, and of course also changes due to immigration, new people coming to our country, to our city, to our region. And so John Sarvey, who you know has been with us since the very beginning, and I decided to devote an entire open classroom from now through April to the whole topic of demography is destiny. How aging, gender relations, racial and ethnic diversity, and immigration are changing everything. And what we want to do today in this introductory course, after that marvelous photo montage that Margaret put together, is to give you an introduction to the course, first tell you about the marvelous things you're going to be seeing. I'm almost blown by the fact of the unbelievable array of incredibly bright and brilliant people we have come to be with us, and then get into looking at some of the data that we're going to be playing with through the semester. So, let me take a look. Whoop, I'm going to need your help, John, to bring up the first of our slides. Yep. So let us take a look at what we're going to do in terms of the subjects we're going to be dealing with and the people we're going to be seeing. We're first of all going to be dealing with a lot of sociological issues. Are any of you, when you were in college or in college now, majored in sociology? Great. So we're going to look at sociological issues. The reshaping of the American family. We're going to start that this week. We're going to look at it even more next week. The impact of demographic change on the nature of urban neighborhoods. How urban neighborhoods are changing. We're going to take a look at generational differences in culture. The baby boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials. Many of you were involved in a survey that we took, and 202 of our students who will be here this year did that survey, and before the end of the evening, we're going to give you the results of that survey. So you'll see who we are here. We're not, as you might expect, kind of a random distribution of the entire population. In fact, I think when you see it, you'll find out we're not random at all in many different ways. But it will give you an idea of some of the generational differences, because we have people from different generations. I'm not a baby boomer. I'm a silent generation because I was born before 1946, as were a number of you. But we're going to take a look at that. We're going to look at the impact of demography on urban space. As you'll see, we're going to have a marvelous photographer with us, who's been with us before, Peter Vanderbarker, who has been looking at how culture shapes architecture. And we're also going to look at how generation shape culture. We're going to look at as I said, the impact of demographic change on visual space and the impact on our public schools. How many of you majored in economics? A few of you, all the way over on the left. Well, we're going to look at economic issues. Who's going to do the work? Implications of an aging workforce on future employment levels and unemployment. By 2020 in Massachusetts, if current trends continue, we'll have about 222,000 more people, in addition to the 6.5 million we have now. In other words, almost no growth in the total population. 222,000 on top of the 6.5 million that we had in the 2010 census that was just released in December. 222,000. 300,000 of that additional 222,000. 300,000 of the additional 222,000 will be over the age of 55. 2/3 of them will be over 65. We'll have 76,000 fewer people, adults 18 to 54. Who's going to do the work? You might ask, who's going to pay the taxes? What will be the role of older workers like some of us in this class, including yours truly? Will we have encore careers, new careers after we, quote unquote, retire? We have a wonderful person joining us to talk about that. What is the impact of immigration on employment opportunity? There are some in our country who want to cut off immigration because they fear that it's reducing economic opportunity for those who are here already. And yet, we also know that without immigration, we would really have some very serious problems, particularly here in Massachusetts. We're going to look at the need to retain and attract young workers to fill jobs and pay taxes, or what I've sometimes called the third Civil War, the civil war between communities to keep young people. How will Boston do it? How will Massachusetts do it? How do we win out when it seems like more and more young people are moving to places like Raleigh, North Carolina, Seattle, Washington, and other parts of the country? How do we keep those young people here? The impact of aging on Social Security. Will Social Security be around for us? Many of you are quite pessimistic. We're going to have the leading expert on Social Security join us, who will tell you, don't worry about Social Security. He's going to explain why. On the other hand, worry about Medicare, Medicaid, and how your health care is going to be funded. The impact of aging on public sector pension programs. That will also, by the way, get us involved in looking at some issues around public unions. And the changing racial and ethnic composition and its impact on jobs and the economy. Those are all some pretty neat economic issues, and we're going to cover all of them sometime during the semester. We're also going to look at political issues. We're going to look at the impact of aging on elections. What happens as America gets older? Does it become more liberal? Does it become more conservative? Should we be concerned about this? And what happens as we have changing racial, ethnic, and gender composition? What is the impact on elections? Good for the Democrats? Good for the Republicans? Good for the Tea Party? Well, stay tuned. We're going to have one of the leading experts in the country joining us from Harvard to talk to us about that, as well as someone from UMass Boston. And what is the impact of changing racial, ethnic, and gender composition of elected officials? How much change have we had in terms of who's in Congress, who's in the State House, who are the governors, right? Said he, if you live in Newton, you're in a very, very interesting community in which both, the President of the United States, your state governor, and the mayor of your city is African American. There aren't too many places like that. And Newton is especially interesting because it only has 1.2% of the population of people who are African American. It's a change that when I was growing up in the 40s and 50s was unimaginable, even in a city like Detroit. So we're going to look at demographic change and culture. We're going to look at the impact of demographic change on language. Right? Cool. Really cool. Right? We're going to look at music. We're going to look at films. We're going to look at theater. We're going to look at art. We're going to look at literature. We're going to look at television. We're going to look at the internet and Facebook and Twitter. Okay? The point that I want to make, and why I think this is maybe going to be the most extraordinary of all the open classrooms, is as we look at the demographic change, of which every one of you in this room is absolutely part of, like a molecule within a spectacular universe. And that changing set of demographics changes everything. We're going to look at international affairs, the role of demographics in explaining economic growth and political power in developed and in developing countries. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were writing books about Japan as number one. We were worried about Japan taking over the world economy. We would be second rate. For the last 20 years, Japan has been almost in permanent recession. It turns out that at least a large part of that is due to demography. Japan has one of the most xenophobic immigration policies in the world. Today, 1.7% of the Japanese public are immigrants. 1.7%. And it's a population aging very rapidly, right? So immigration policy as part of demographic policy can be fundamental to economic prosperity. We're going to look at those things. We're going to look at zero population growth. Too much population, is that good? Is that bad? Too little population growth? What's the answer? Right? So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to look at Israel. We're going to ask the question, can Israel afford to be a one-party state in the future, or must it go to a two-state solution? Israel wants to be a Jewish state, and it wants to be a democratic state. But if you go out to about 2050, 2060, Israeli Arabs will dominate the number of Israeli Jews. You either decide it's no longer a Jewish state, or you decide that you'll take the franchise away from Israeli Arabs who currently have it. Or you decide to split the country in two. Fascinating. We'll look at China. China has a one-child policy. When you think about that, that's very interesting. You don't have any brothers and sisters. But then think about it. In the second generation, you don't have any cousins, you don't have any aunts, you don't have any uncles. Right? That, I presume, is why China does not celebrate Thanksgiving. Who would be around the table? But the Economist magazine 3 weeks ago had a cover story saying that India will surpass China, in part because of the one-child policy, and that if the one-child policy continues, China will have the same problem that Japan has. We're going to look at Egypt. Egypt has a rapidly growing population. A few years ago, I accompanied a group of Northeastern students and professors to Cairo, to Alexandria. Well, we had the wonderful opportunity to meet with the Minister of Planning for Egypt, for the country. And we asked him, how can Cairo continue to grow? It's got 9 million people in it. Any of you have ever been in Cairo? Pretty difficult to get around, people racing around. It's an absolutely crazy city. Their goal is no more people living in, no more population growth in Cairo. So I said, well, where will the people live? And he says, we're building 100 new cities of at least 100,000 each in the desert. I said, sure. And the next day, the minister took us out to Gulf land, G-O-L-F land, in the desert about 40 miles outside of Cairo, where with water being pumped from the Nile, they were building an entire new city of 100,000 plus, built around 2 very beautiful 18-hole golf courses. The only problem was that the only homes out of thousands that we saw that were occupied were right along the fairways of the golf courses, and none of the others were around. There were houses there, no one was living in it. And the real problem is that despite this policy, Egyptians live in massive extended families, And you can't just pick up one nuclear family and move them from Cairo to Gulfland. You've got to get the uncles and the aunts and the cousins and the brothers and the sisters and the in-laws to go with them, and that doesn't happen. And so these cities are filled with houses which are filled with no one. That's all demography. That's what we're going to be looking at. So let me give you a little bit more detail, week by week, of what we're going to be looking at this semester. Today, John and I are going to introduce you to the world of demographic change from the family to the world. We're going to start in terms of our journey by looking at the smallest unit, the family. You'll see changes in family structure since World War II later this evening. We're going to go on and take a look at the community and the neighborhood. We're moving out from the family to the neighborhood and neighborhood change. We're going to look, for example, at how changing racial and ethnic segregation has appeared in our society. We're going to move out to look at the workplace. We're going to take a look at the schools, the changing demographic of our schools, particularly inner city schools. We're going to take a look at how all of this affects the city, the state, the nation, and the world. So we're doing demography is destiny by geography before the end of this semester. Next week we have two absolutely spectacular people joining us. Kathy Eaton, who's been at Harvard for a good number of years, who's been studying the family for years, is joining us, along with Kenneth Johnson, who is probably the leading demographer in the entire Northeast. He's at the University of New Hampshire in the Casey Institute. And we're going to be taking a look at the changing role of men and women, the changing family structure, and particularly, on the basis of Kenneth's latest work, the changing face of America's children and the impact on the economy and politics. Because, of course, our children's demography is changing faster than ours. What does it mean for society? And what does it mean for economic opportunity? And he's going to raise an absolutely incredible question, and that is, are our children going to be so hard-pressed that they're not going to be particularly interested in making sure that we do well in our old age? Will there be a generational conflict? Particularly if the people retiring tend to be predominantly white and the children are predominantly young people of color. Who will take care of whom? We're going to take a look how the concept of home and hearth may be changing in generational change. In the second week, or third week, sorry you can't see that, we're going to look at prismatic communities. Communities that are changing in terms of their color, in terms of their demographics. We have my friend Richard Jacone, who is the director of the Office of Refugees and Immigrants here in Massachusetts, and also on our faculty in the School of Journalism, and Mary Waters from Harvard, who have looked at these questions. We're going to look at the new demographics of our immigrant population, how that's changed over time. We're going to look at immigration and intergroup relations between immigrant groups and immigrant groups and native-born groups. In week 4, we're going to change our attention to looking at the workplace and how that's changed. And we have Osborne Jackson joining us, a new colleague of mine in the economics department, who comes out of the University of Michigan, who's been looking at specifically this question of the new workplace and the community. And Bob Triest, friend of mine, who's a senior economist at the Boston Fed. And we'll be looking at the changing role of women in the workforce, the changing role of minorities in the workforce, the impact of demographic change on U.S. labor markets, the impact of immigration on job opportunity, changing culture due to generational shifts in the workplace, baby boomers versus Gen Xers. And then in week 5, we'll continue taking a look at the workplace, but we have Professor Joe Quinn of the Economics Department at Boston College and former Dean of Arts and Sciences from Boston College, and Phyllis Siegel, the president of Civic Ventures, an organization that has been looking into the whole question of encore careers. What do people like Bluestone do when they retire from Northeastern but aren't ready to really retire? Something that maybe some of you in this classroom are thinking about too. And we'll be looking at the impact of demographic change on employment and unemployment, the impact of demographic change on Social Security and retirement, and the role of older workers and encore careers, and younger workers. When we get to week 6 in February, we turn our attention to looking at demographic change in our public schools, and we're very fortunate to have John Logan joining us, professor of sociology from Brown University, and also the director of the largest demographic project going on in the United States outside of the Census Bureau this year, Russell Sage Foundation's Decennial Census Project. He's the director of it. I'm on the advisory board. He's one of the leading demographers, and he's been looking particularly at the whole question of the changing racial and ethnic composition of urban and suburban schools, and what that means in terms of educational inequality. Then, as I said, by the 8th week, we start looking at visualizing the evolving American city with our own Joanna Londano here from Northeastern University, and Peter Vanderbarker, who joined us a couple semesters ago, who is probably the leading photographer of architecture maybe in the world. And he's coming back to share his latest work on looking how architecture changes generationally. Right? Take a break. When we come back on March 9th, we have a very, very, very special evening. We're going to bring 2 classes together. My class, this class, the open classroom that John and I are teaching, and a class on the 21st century, or the city, and particularly older industrial cities, which is taught by my colleague, Professor Joan Fitzgerald. And we've invited an old dear friend of mine, Dan Oatprint, to join us. Give you a little history of Dan, and you'll hear it again when he's here. Dan and I went to the University of Michigan together. He was the editor of the Michigan Daily. From there, he moved to Western Massachusetts with his new wife, who's a poet, and he started the New England Journal. From there, he became associate editor of a small little magazine called Time, and also associate editor of Life magazine. Turned down the editorship of Sports Illustrated, founded Rotisserie Baseball, and finally ended that part of his career by being the first public editor ombudsman for the New York Times. This is a superstar. He's also just finished last year a phenomenal book called Last Call, which is the definitive social history of Prohibition. I recommend it to you. But 2 years ago, Dan went back to Time magazine and pitched a very special personal project to them. That is that they take a group of young journalists and place them in the city of Detroit, where we both grew up, for an entire year. They even bought a house on the east side. And over the year, these journalists have been reporting on, is it possible for an older industrial city undergoing tremendous demographic change, race, age, immigration, and so forth, is there any way this city can come back? They just completed that year. Dan wrote the opening cover story in Time magazine. That will be on our website. And the final story. He's going to be here, along with Teresa Lynch, colleague of ours at the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City, which has had an ongoing project in Detroit, trying to ask the question, what is needed to bring a city like Detroit back? Let me just put it bluntly. If we can bring Detroit back, we can bring back almost any place, right? Teresa and Dan will be holding forth that day. The aging of cities, the impact of growing income and wealth inequality on city life, and Detroit, a case study. We'll then come back home, and we're going to ask a very interesting question: will demographics bankrupt Massachusetts? We have joining us my colleague here at the School of Public Policy and Affairs, Alan Clayton Matthews, who also happens to be on the Council of Economic Advisors for Governor Patrick, and Alicia Sasser, senior economist at the Boston Fed. And they're going to be looking at what we have called, I've called sometimes the third Civil War, the competition for young workers and families, competition across cities, states, regions of the country. We're going to look at domestic in-migration, who's moving from one place to another and why. We're going to be looking at the impact of the aging population on revenues and public spending. I gave you the numbers earlier: 300,000 more older people, 76,000 fewer younger people. Who's going to pay taxes? And how are we going to have enough revenue to take care of people who may need more services as they get older? And we're going to talk a little bit about the so-called public pension crisis and what can be done about it. We're then going to take a look at demographic change, politics, and culture. And we have a young, new, fascinating political scientist from the government department at Harvard, Ryan Enos, who is an expert on the whole question of how racial and ethnic change affects our politics within the state, nationwide, and so forth. And we hope to have Paul Watanabe join us again. Some of you may remember we had Paul here after the election to comment on the election. He's also a commentator for Channel 5. They're going to be here taking a look at how the impact of immigration, aging, and racial ethnic change on elections, politics, and public policy. And then, in week 11, we're going to ask the question, can America afford an aging society? And we have Deborah Bander from the American Association for Retired People, although they don't use that name anymore. It's just AARP, because retired people turns out to be a bad word. So we don't use retired people anymore. It's just AARP. It's like KFC isn't, we never can use the word fried again. So the impact of aging population on Social Security, will you ever collect it? And the impact of aging population on healthcare financing. We also hope to have someone else here who's been working very closely on the healthcare financing issue. And then in week 12, near the end of the semester, we're going to look at demographic change and the affluence of nations with Martin White, who has done enormous studies of other countries. We're going to be looking at Japan or the Geriatric Society, China, India, racing with the population bomb, Russia, population decline and its impacts, and we hope to also get into Western Europe. So we're not only staying home in Boston, we're not staying home in Massachusetts, we're not staying home in the US, we're going abroad. And then finally, on our last class on April 13th, we have our dear friend Larry Lowenthal, who for many years was the director of the American Jewish Committee here in Boston, spent more than 20 years teaching in Israel, and Dennis Sullivan, who heads up our International Affairs program here at Northeastern and an expert on Egypt, looking at Israel and the Middle East, looking at population growth in Egypt, and taking a look at the environment, population roots of instability and violence. That's what we're going to do in the next 13 weeks. So I hope you will stay with us. Before we go on and give you kind of an introduction of all of this, looking at some of the things that John and I've prepared, any questions? Sound interesting?
Yes.
I can promise you, even for those of you who've been for every open classroom with some of the great Nobel laureates we've brought here and others, this is going to be fun. And again, I think one of the most exciting thing about it, if you can continue as you go through this class to think about it in terms of where you're positioned in all of this. Both your generation, right? Where you're positioned racially, ethnically, in terms of your gender, how you're positioned in all of this, because this is more than anything else we've done really very much about you and me and all of us, and that's what we'll be doing. So, ready to get into it?
Yes.
Let's just set the stage, okay? Happy birthday, baby boomers. Who was born sometime between January 1st, 1946 and December 31st, 1964? Most of you. Large number of baby boomers here. Well, happy birthday, because the first baby boomer turned 65. Her name is Kathy Casey Hirschling. She was the first one born at 12:01 on January 1st, 1946. And what's interesting about the baby boom generation is that in that single generation, there were 78 million births. Right? It was about 40 million more births than we would have had under the old birth rates between World War I and World War II, and about the same amount of additional births that we would have had following the baby boom generation. So it was a massive generation. What's fascinating about that generation is, of course, it changed America in so many ways. If you think about, for example, the things that changed in America with this huge number of kids that most of you were. I was born in 44, so I'm just on the beginning, just before the baby boom generation. But with all those kids, this country, America, was turned over to children, right? If you want to think of the kind of iconic expression of that generation, it's Disney World. Disneyland, actually, first in California, and then Disney World. It's also the suburbs. We think of suburbs as being developed because of FHA policy and things like that, But what happened is we had all these children, and mom and dad wanted them to have their own little backyard with a swing set. And we had to move to the suburbs to do that. We had Romper Room. We had the Mickey Mouse Club. M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E. Right? Mickey Mouse, da-da-da-da. Right. We changed America to be child-centered. What's interesting now, of course, is with Kathy's birth, that Romper Room, Mickey Mouse Club generation is now starting to be over 65 years old. And that huge generation is coming through, and we are going to have to change, not we have to, it's going to happen, is we're going to change the orientation of America to older people, to us, right? What is the equivalent of Disneyland for 72-year-olds? Think on it. What is the equivalent of the suburban tract house for aging baby boomers, right? That's what we're going to be talking about here. The fact is that boomers are now hitting age 65 at a rate of more than 8,000 a day, right? So today is January 13th, multiply 13 by 8,000, and that's how many more people over 65 we have since New Year's. So, are they that different from those who came before and those who were born after? Culturally, economically, socially. That's what we're going to be taking a look at. Let's take a look at American generations. These are how there's the kind of standard definition of generations. Beginning in 1900 through 1924, if you were born then. Anybody born in that period? We actually have one person who RSVP'd. But for us, many of us, this would be our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation, also known as the GI generation. And the way, as you'll see in a few minutes, that people, sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, define generations has something to do with when you came of age, right? What was going on in society that helped form your personality, your personal culture? And of course, this was the generation that came of age during World War I through World War II. The early ones were often in World War I or associated with the generation that was. The later part of this generation were the people who fought World War II. And in between, lived through the Great Depression. The silent generation, from 1925 to 1945, were children during the Great Depression, right? Great Depression starts in 1929, 1930, so these kids were 5 or 6 years old. They come of age during the Depression, and they also then, the earliest, remember World War II and were likely drafted to that war. Then there are the baby boom generation, most of you. Post-World War II glory day children. You will grow up during a period of time of the most rapid economic expansion in the history of any country on earth. From 1947 to 1973, in a single generation, your generation, 1947 to 73, during that time, real wages grew by over 82%, the average real wage. As mom came into the workforce, median household income, median family income, for the first time in a single generation, doubled. That's inflation-adjusted income, doubled in a single generation. At the end of that generation, 25 years or so, the typical family in America had twice as much real stuff as at the beginning of that generation. To give you an idea, the current generation has seen no growth in their median family income at all. That changes the way you think about it. It has to do with your feelings of optimism, your feelings of affluence, your feelings of prosperity, your feelings of what kind of risk you might be willing to take. It was a very special generation. Then take a look at the generations that follow. Generation X, 65 to 79, they're coming of age after 1973 when the economy slows down dramatically. Recessions in 73, 71, 72, recessions in 79, 80, 81, probably the worst recession until the current one. It's an age of, to use Jimmy Carter's term, economic malaise. nowhere like the baby boom generation, but just one generation later. Very different economics, very, very different sociology. And then we get to the millennials, Generation Y, growing up in a period in which, as children, a return to political conservatism, right? The election of Ronald Reagan, the re-election of Ronald Reagan, the election of George Bush the first. So, and then finally we have the new silent generation, as some people put it, Generation Z. They start coming of age soon after 9/11, where for the first time a generation of children can see massive conflict on our own shores. Wow. Let's take a look at the baby boomers. This is according to the latest bulletin from the AARP. Healthiest, best educated, and wealthiest in the nation's history, according to AARP. A generation that spans from the Beatles through Springsteen. Crusaded to end a war and stop the spread of nukes. How many were involved in the anti-war movement during the 1960s? Wow. Powered an explosion in technology, from the first transistor and putting a man on the moon to the smartphones we have today, and fueled the feminist revolution and joined the battle for civil rights both in the North and the South. Wow. But a generation that has also saved too little, eaten too much, borrowed beyond its means. This trifecta puts our healthcare system, our economy, and the well-being of our children and our parents at risk. Whew. Will this set off generational conflict, some ask? Education, pouring more money into education for our young versus pouring more money into Social Security to make sure it's there when we retire. Children's health versus making sure that we have enough funding for Medicare for us over 62. Popular tax cuts that might be good for us who grew up in a period of great wealth and prosperity versus a tax policy enabling people to work longer. In a book that came out quite recently, I haven't read the whole novel, by Christopher Buckley, called Boomsday, Mr. Buckley's main character, Cassandra Devine, is a trendy 29-year-old PR whiz, touts a way to ease boomers' pressure on Medicare and Social Security. She says, let's give boomers incentives, she suggests, free Botox and no estate tax, for starters, if they agree to commit suicide at age 70. She calls it voluntary transitioning. And it eventually inspires in the novel a presidential campaign that in turn ignites a fiery opposition from the religious right and from boomers upset by demonstrations that block their golf courses in their retirement communities. It's all demography, folks. It's not all dry statistics, right? What's the alternative, says AARP? As boomers, we arrive at age 65 in these grim economic times. We understand that instead of having generational conflict, we need each other. It's not a fight, it's a family. Generations United, an organization that was formed recently, says good policies, Social Security, public education, affordable health care, do not impact one generation at the expense of another. We must look at generations as interdependent. So one of the questions we're going to raise all during this semester, because there's a lot of demography that raises all kinds of scary things if you happen to live even before last week in Arizona, or live in Alaska where you can see the Soviet Union, about translating that into what they call an adult conversation, something seemingly missing in Washington, D.C., according to AARP, which is how do we deal with a nation that faces gigantic budget deficits and a mix of government services and obligations that are out of whack and out of date? Demography is behind all of this. That is what we want to have. This semester is devoted to an adult conversation about those things that are most important in our lives. Any thoughts? Julie?
Barry, when you were going through the different breakpoints for each of the generations, it was interesting that for the new silent generation, there's only a 10-year span. Whereas
Right.
previously, there were longer spans, between 15 and 20-year spans. Why do they attribute that?
We're going to see in the next set of slides that I'm going to do that there are two academics, Strauss and Howe, who have thought a lot about this whole question of generations. And they suggest in some of their writings that we have these long spans of generations that are 50 to 70 years long, kind of the length of a lifetime, at least today. But at other times they talk about it as occurring during particular times in history where there is either a crisis or an awakening. And so some generations can be collapsed very quickly, right? Like the generation that came of age during the Great Depression, right? Or ones that are longer that came of age during a long economic boom, such as the baby boomers. But we'll look at that now. Another question or thought? Comment? This is your class. Okay. Well, let's take a look at this to set us up. An overview of generational behavior, attitudes, and leadership. So one way of looking at just family generations, this is not sociological, this is mathematical, is it's the average time between a mother's first offspring and her daughter's first offspring. That's one way of defining a generation. Has nothing to do with the economy, has nothing to do with anything except when we procreate. In the United States, as of 2007, that average time was 25.2 years. Okay? And in the UK, a little longer, 27.4. And that's why often when we talk about generations, people talk about a generation being about 25 years long, 4 generations, a century. But there's also the concept of a cultural generation, cohorts of people who were born in the same date range, same time range, and share similar cultural experiences, the way we've been talking about the World War I, the Great War, World War II, the Depression, post 9/11, and the kinds of things that would impact a generation culturally would be changes in technology. My grandmother, who was born in 1905, right, witnessed the growth of just the beginnings of the the modern automobile, powered by a gasoline engine, right through to her lifetime saw us land somebody on the moon. Our kids who are growing up can't imagine that when I was going to college, I didn't have a laptop computer. I didn't even have a computer at work. The only computer I had was the computer lab in the big computer center, where there was a computer the size of this room that had the power of my cell phone, right? To my 19-year-old son, this makes no sense. I mean, this is... And we also know that technology is just speeding up, and speeding up, right? From, the first cell phones to the iPhone 4 and the Droid in just a few years. Economic change, ecological change, and how this affects the mindset of a generation during a cohort's formative years between childhood and adulthood, as our children are growing up, right? Karl Mannheim, famous sociologist, emphasized that the rapidity of social change in youth was crucial to the formation of generations. In periods of rapid social change, a generation would be much more likely to develop a cohesive character. So it's times of crisis, times of sharp change, possibly like post 9/11, certainly like the Great Depression, certainly like times of Great War, or stress because of social movements. That's when generations grow up very quickly. I went to the University of Michigan as a freshman in 1962. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis in my first year, where we thought that we were all going to be blown to kingdom come by Russian and US missiles going to war. I was an undergraduate during the beginning of the Vietnam War, at least our large engagement, so that by 1968 we had 500,000 troops engaged. I was there during the anti-war movement, the rise of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King. I lived through the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King in 1968, of Malcolm X. Those are formative years in a short period of time. And of course, by then, this was a generation who not only could hear about it on radio or read it about it in a 19th century newspaper, but saw it that night immediately at the California Los Angeles Convention Center and seeing Bobby Kennedy assassinated a minute after. Wow, what an impact it would have on you. And think of all the ways it affects the way you think about society, humanity, the way you think about your own safety, the way you think about where the world's going. Pretty interesting stuff. If we look at Western world generations, we can go back to the lost generation, the generation of 1914 in Europe. Gertrude Stein would write about this. Those who fought in World War I, the war that would end all war. The greatest generation that Tom Brokaw talks about, the veterans of World War II. Your parents, in many cases. The silent generation, the children of the Great Depression. The baby boom generation, most of you. Rejection of some of the traditional values, right? Associated with privilege and affluence in an affluent time. Generation X, the baby bust generation. Generation Y, the echo boomers. Generation Z, the internet generation, the digital natives, as some people call it. But we can also look at it in terms of other parts of the world. In China, the post-80s China generation Y, born 1980 to 89, as we move out of the Cultural Revolution into an age of what turns out to be something that looks like capitalism, but not much like true democracy. Get the one-child policy and the little emperors. Optimism for the future, newfound consumerism and entrepreneurship. Shanghai moves from being a city which has a standard of living not much higher than the less developed world, to where it has a standard of living today no different than Italy. In a single decade. Take a look at Korea, defined around the democratization of South Korea, the democratization generation. The June 3rd, 1987 generation, which witnessed the June uprising, some of us may remember, or the uprising against Syngman Rhee in 1960. Or in India, independence in 1947, Mahatma Gandhi, a watershed in terms of generations. People born in the 1930s and 40s tended to be loyal to this new state. Indian boomers born after independence and into the early 1990s tended to link success to leaving India, and were suspicious of traditional values and institutions. They came to America, in many cases, to be our doctors. And then Generation X has seen an improvement in the economy, as we see India's booming GDP. And Generation Y, those born during the last decade, see a continuing of this pattern. So I mentioned about these two guys, Strauss and Howe, and they have been doing probably more on generational theory, not because I believe this necessarily. They really think in broad terms, but I want to introduce this to you. So they've written two important books. The first one they wrote together, Generations, and following Strauss's death, Neil Howe wrote a book called Fourth Turning, which came out a little over a decade ago. And their argument is that you can think of all of American history as a series of what they call generational biographies, going back actually to before 1620. And they examine in these books changes in human attitudes and behavior and in social mood. What does a generation share in the Strauss-Howe approach? One, an age, location, and history. These are people who come of age, who encounter some key historical changes simultaneously. And that's what they share. We share the Vietnam era. We share the post 9/11 era. We shared the Great Depression. out of this comes a set of not universally shared beliefs, but a kind of consensus belief. That there's a dominant belief, a dominant set of behaviors, which may be different than that of other generations. And there is the perceived membership in that generation. Most of you in this class said you're members of baby boom generation. Do you think of yourselves as part of the baby boom generation? Or does that not matter very much to you? How many think I'm a baby boomer? Good number of you. So, there are two different types of eras that they talk about. One type of era are crises. These are periods in which there's great social upheaval, Great Depression, World War II, possibly the post-9/11 terrorist attack. And it's a time in which we kind of all of a sudden rejigger the way we think about it. I happened to be here at Northeastern on the morning of 9/11. And as I was driving in to school, we heard the first reports on NPR that a plane had crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Towers. It so happens that my late father was just coming out of a subway, I forget the year, when a B25 Bomber in the fog crashed into the Empire State Building. He was right near there, 34th Street. And I remember him telling the story. And my immediate reaction was, God, what a horrible, horrible accident. How could this happen modern times? And of course I thought of fog, and then I look up, and of course it was absolutely blue skies. It was a beautiful day. And then as the news came in, I dashed into the office, and I raced down to the political science department where we had a TV set up, and right next to me, and standing with me as we watched all of this with a few students, was Michael Dukakis. And as the news came in, and the second plane hit, and then the plane that hit the Pentagon, and then the plane that went down in Pennsylvania, I remember Mike just turning to all of us and just said, "This changes everything." That was the first comment on that generation. And does that affect our children growing up at the time? More than it might even affect us, because that is what they recall. Okay. There are other times that Strauss and Hull call awakenings, a time of cultural or religious renewal.